Welcome to a re-recording of Intro to Backend's Demo 1. We're sorry that demo was a little rushed today. We're still getting the hang of things. But here we are with the re-recording, so hopefully it'll be paced better and you'll be able to follow along better. So I'm actually going to go ahead and link some timestamps below because I'm going to start all the way from the start with covering some terminal tricks, setting up virtual environments and all that. So if you want to skip ahead to the code, feel free to do that in the timestamps below. So let's get started. So how do we first get the project started in the first place? So this is a backend textbook. You all should have access to this. You should have bookmarked it or have some sort of way of accessing it. And from here, you would want to go to chapter 1, routes, and click on pre-class to-dos. Now here are some instructions on if you still haven't downloaded Postman or Python 3 or text editor of your choice. But for this class, we recommend using VS Code because that's just what we're used to using. And yeah, assuming you've done that, let's go ahead and download our starter code. So that's right here. And now we have a zipped folder or zipped file. So now I like to be organized, and you should be too. But preferably you'd put it in a folder that makes sense to you. I have a folder for my spring semester and a folder for this intro to backend class and a demo. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this zip file into my demo folder and unzip it there. Cool. So now that we have unzipped our source folder, let's get into terminal and see how we can navigate to this folder and start, running our code. So I'm going to open terminal, and this is something along the lines of what you should see. Yeah. So the first command I'm going to teach you guys is cd. Cd stands for change directory. So I'm going to cd into my documents folder. And now another command I'd like to show you guys is list. List shows every folder and every file in the directory that you're currently in. So I'm in the directory documents. So if I list everything, I should see these folders and I should see these files. And as you can see, it shows everything correctly. Another trick you can do, which is pretty cool, is you can cd, and after cd, this is the directory that you want to change your current directory to. So if I want to jump straight to the source folder, I can actually drag this into my terminal, and boom, I'm in the source folder. Now, if you're curious about which directory I'm currently in, you can also use a command pwd, print working directory, and it'll tell you which directory you're in. So list for seeing the contents, print working directory for seeing where you're currently at. Another cool thing you can do is cat. Cat shows the contents of the file. So if I wanted to see what's inside requirements.txt without having to go to my finder and everything, I can do cat requirements.txt, and boom, that's the files that we have in requirements.txt. Another command that will be useful to you guys is touch. So touch creates a file with the specified name. So if I touch readme.txt, it'll create me a readme file, which you can go ahead and you'll actually need to submit one of these for every assignment to specify your net ID so we can identify you. But you can, it's a text file. You can type whatever you want, close it to save it, and so on. This actually belongs outside. Yeah, sorry, my camera froze for a sec. But another thing you should know about terminal is how to reference directories that are one behind you. Because if, let's say, I wanted to get to demo 1, how do I do that? Well, I can't cd into demo 1 because cd and typing something in refers to something that's inside my current directory, and the two files that are inside it are app.py and requirements.txt. So the way you go backwards in terminal is by 2 dots. 2 dots refers to the previous directory, 1 dot refers to the current directory. So I can go back, and now if I want to open the current directory I'm in VS Code, there's actually a shorthand command for that. It's code, and then I have to reference which directory I want to open, and I want to open the current one because I'm in demo 1 already, so in which I would type dot. So this open VS Code in the directory specified, which was demo1. Cool. On VS Code, you can actually use a terminal within here as well. So let's go ahead and get a terminal started. Okay, now that we're here, the next step is to create a virtual environment. Again, a virtual environment is used to isolate dependencies for projects because we don't want dependencies being globally installed and screwing up with our other projects. So the way we set up a virtual environment is by typing python 3-m v and the name of our virtual environment. We didn't mention this in lecture, but we heavily emphasize that you should call your virtual environment v just for standard practices. And another thing worth mentioning is that your v should be directly outside your source folder. This is also standard practices that you should get into the habit of using if you can. So if y'all remember correctly, the way you activate a virtual environment is for a Mac is .venv bin activate. Right. Refer to the textbook if you want to remember how to do it for Windows. But the way you can tell that you're in the virtual environment is through this venv tag thing before your hostname. This indicates that you're currently in the virtual environment. Again, to get out of the virtual environment, you have to type deactivate, and this thing will go away. Make sure you don't forget to activate and deactivate it. That way you're not installing dependencies in incorrect locations. So now that we're in our virtual environment, let's install the dependencies for this project specifically. How do we do that? We can see that requirements.txt, which has the list of all our requirements or all our dependencies, is in the source folder, the src folder. So let's change directory into the source folder. Let's just check that the requirements.txt is there. It is. And from here, we can install our dependencies. So the way you do that is pip3 install -r and requirements.txt. Cool. Now we have all the dependencies installed in our virtual environment. So let's test it. Let's run app.py, right? So the way you do it is python 3 app.py. And now our server is active. So let's check if the server is active. Let's actually go on Google Chrome or any browser of your choice and go to the specified URL, which is 0000 or localhost 5000. So we can do 0000:5000. Great, so it tells us hello world. You can actually replace this with localhost and it'll do the same thing. So a neat thing about Flask is that whenever you make changes and you save your file, it'll actually dynamically save it, and you wouldn't have to restart the server again. It'll just handle everything like that for you. So if, let's say, I want to change this to hello Shango and save it, you can see down here that it's restarting on its own. And if I refresh this page, it'll say hello Shango. So that's a very neat thing about Flask, that it kind of like responds to your saves. The one thing I will note is if you have errors in your program and your server crashes, then you will have to restart the server. Anyway, before we start going into coding our demo, let's discuss the syntax of Flask. So what even is Flask in the first place, and how does it work? So Flask acts as a middleman who takes in requests, right? So requests are made from browsers or clients, and then basically calls a Python function for you. So app.route is Flask's way of saying, at this endpoint, call this function. So if I make app.route and I have, say, hello, or like greetings, and we define a function called greetings, and we return greetings. Then, if we hit this endpoint, which by the way is localhost 5000, and then this is what comes, whatever is inside the string is actually what comes after localhost 5000. It prints greetings. Amazing. So now that we know the syntax of Flask, I'm actually going to get rid of this because this is just for demonstration purposes. Right, let's get into the demo. So, how do we start coding up a backend that is going to be useful for us? Well, in this demo, we're going to show how to make a to-do app, a to-do list kind of app. So the way we're going to store information is through a Python dictionary. So let's make a Python dictionary called tasks. Okay, so we're back. We just made a hard-coded dictionary with 2 tasks, right? So we represent a task with a dictionary as well. It's going to have an ID field, it's going to have a description field, and it's going to have a done field. So the ID is going to be important for identifying tasks because each task will have a unique ID. This number will allow us to identify things correctly. Because if we have 2 tasks called laundry, then it gets complicated in how to identify them. So the way we're going to do it for this class is just to use numbers, unique numbers for that matter. Description is just going to be the description of the task, and done is going to be if we're done with the task or not. So we have 2 tasks created. So let's go about making endpoints, right? Like we discussed in class, endpoints for interacting with this data structure. Also, one quick thing I forgot to mention. Make sure you add these 2 lines. They're libraries that we're importing into our Python file, so we can use external libraries, and I forgot to mention it, but yeah, make sure you add these 2 lines. So let's examine what we just created. We use app.route to tell Flask, hey look, at endpoint tasks, I want you to call this function. So what exactly is the function doing? Well, res is just a variable. A result is creating a dictionary with tasks being the key and these tasks as the values. And then it's just returning it. JSON.dumps is an external tool that formats our output in JSON format. Yeah, so let's test this. Is this actually going to work? Am I going to see these 2 tasks when I hit this endpoint? Well, if we go back to our browser and type in tasks, you can see that it actually prints the 2 tasks that we created. So this actually works. But if you look at this, right, we're not going to test a lot of things using our browser. It doesn't look pretty. It just doesn't seem like it's meant to be. So what we're going to be using for testing our code is this app called Postman. So let's open Postman. This is what a lot of you will probably see when you begin Postman. So the first thing you should do is create a workspace. I've actually already created one called Backend course, but you can click create a workspace and create one really easily. Now once you click on create workspace, you're going to see something like this. The first thing we want to do is create a collection. A collection is basically a collection of requests that you can use to test different endpoints in your project. So since we're on our programming assignment 1 or our demo 1, let's just make a new collection and call it demo 1. Right? If you're working on a programming assignment, this would be called PA1. Cool. So we made a collection called demo 1. Now it's a folder of collections. So let's add a request. And maybe our first thing that we want to do is to get all the tasks that we have. So let's call this get all tasks. And again, the request URL is just what we typed up here, localhost 5000/tasks. Move my camera a bit down. So let's hit send. And voila, that looks much better. It tells us, you can just see from indentation that these are the 2 tasks that we have. By the way, if this is not how you guys see your response, it's probably because this is set to, I think, either text or HTML by default, but if you change it to JSON, it'll look like this. The way you make it so that it returns it in JSON by default is if you click on here and go to settings, you can change the language detection from auto to JSON, so make sure you do that too. Cool, so our first endpoint works. We can get all the tasks. Amazing. Let's go back to our code. And let's create a different route. By the way, one thing to note is that a route defined by default is a get method. But for the following methods, the next few methods, we will be defining what kind of request type we're going to be accepting. So the next one is going to be to create a task. So we're back. There's a lot of code I just wrote, but let's dissect it one by one, just like we did with the previous function. So the first thing I did was create a variable called task ID counter. This is to keep track of the number of tasks we have, and this is to ensure that each task will have a unique ID. For example, if I delete task 1 right now from our dictionary, maybe depending on the way we implement it, we might think that the next ID is 1 because that's the next number that doesn't exist in our dictionary. But we don't actually want that. We want every task that's created to have a unique identifier, a unique identifying number. So the way we do that is we have a variable that keeps track of which ID number would be the next number to use. So in this case, it would be 0, 1, so it would be 2. So that's what task ID counter is. This line right here is just Python syntax. This means even within this function, please reference the global task ID counter, which is the one up here, as opposed to making a local variable, which if you know something about scopes, you should know about. Otherwise, you can look up what scope means. It just means that this is a global variable as opposed to a local variable which lives only within a function. The next line, body equals json.loads request.data. This line is important because it converts a request body into a dictionary. So now that body contains a dictionary with the request body, right, we can extract the description by just referencing the description and storing it in a variable called description. And now that we have the description, we can make a new task object with the ID task ID counter, right? Which this always contains a new number. The description will be description that we extracted from the request body, and by default, let's just say a task that we newly create is not done. Now that we've created a new task, we can add it to our dictionary by doing this line. This increments the number. So if let's say we add a task with task ID 2, the next task ID would have the ID 3. So therefore, we're incrementing it by 1. The final line, return json.dumps task, and then 201 returns our newly created task. By the way, the second number is the response code that we discussed in class as well. 200 is a successful response. 201 is different from 200 in that it represents a successful creation of an object as opposed to just a generic successful response, but you don't have to worry about that too much. So let's create a new request called create task. Again, we specified it was a post request. The reason why it's a post request is because we're sending information to the server as opposed to get request, which is just retrieving information to the from the server. So we make it a post request. This is the URL we had. We can copy it, paste it here because it's the same URL or the endpoint. And how do we put in a request body? Well, that can be done by clicking on this body tab right here. We have to click raw to type in a raw body and change this to a JSON format. So the description, let's make our new task, finish playing Pokemon Legends Arceus, because I have not done that. And let's send this to the server. So if I move my camera back up, you can see that a newly created task was returned to me. Now, how do I know if this was actually added to my dictionary? Well, we can go to get all tasks and send. And now we see that if we scroll down, a third task has been created. Wow, amazing. We could just keep doing this. So another one could maybe be like, stop procrastinating. Right, now it has an ID of 3 as opposed to 2, right? Because we incremented it by 1. And if we send it, wow, we have 4 tasks now. Cool. So the next endpoint I want to create is to get a task by its ID. Right, this will be important because if, let's say, you're creating any app with users and you want to get a specific user's information, they'll probably have a unique ID and you'll have to get a user by that ID. So I just wrote up get task by task ID. So what this does is it gets a task given its task ID. You'll notice that the endpoint here is slightly different than what we've previously seen. You'll see this little funky int task ID thing. And what this does is it's information included within the URL. So this means that we can hit an endpoint, say tasks, and then type in 0 here. And this 0 will be inserted as task ID, which will be inserted into the function, and then will be used within the function. So yeah, this is how you include information within the URL. And in fact, I can show a real life example. So on GradeScope, you'll see that my algo class has an ID 285290, whereas my 3410 class has the ID 323321. Similarly, users will have IDs and we can reference them by having the task ID be included within our URL. So what does this do? Get task, well, it gets a task with task ID. This is Python syntax to retrieve a value from a dictionary, and if it doesn't actually, if that key doesn't exist within the dictionary, it'll just contain none or nothing. In which case it'll enter this if statement and it'll return the error task not found, which has a response code 404, like a lot of you know. Otherwise, if it has found a task, it'll return the task with a response code 200 indicating success. So let's test this. So we have our two tasks again, laundry and homework. Let's create a request called get task by ID. And paste this here. And again, we can include the task number within our URL. So let's try to reference the task ID 0, which would be laundry. And if we send this, you can see that I only get the laundry task. If I put in 1, you'll see that I'll only get the homework task. Amazing. So the next one I want to write up is update task. What if I want to update one of my tasks? Cool. So I just wrote a function update task. A lot of it will be similar parts combined from previous routes, but you'll see that the route is actually the same as the get task route, and the method is the same as our create task route. So the reason why the route is the same is because we want to reference a specific task to change, and why the method is the same is because we're sending data to the server being the updated description and the updated, if it's done or not. JSON.loads again gets the request body, and these two lines will update it accordingly, and then I'll return it with return response codes 200. So let's create an endpoint for that as well. Or request post update task. All right, it's the same URL as this, and in our body, let's type in description. My first task was laundry, so let's do dry laundry, and maybe let's change done to true. So let's send this and see if it works. Cool, so it looks like we got a task with ID 0 with description dry laundry and done if it's done is true. Let's see if it actually worked. We can click on get all tasks and check that. Boom, it looks like it worked. Our description is now dry laundry and done is true. The final endpoint I want to make is for deleting a task. If I'm done with the task and I don't care about it anymore, let's make an endpoint for that. Okay, so this is our delete task method. You'll see that it's, again, syntactically very similar to the previous functions. The only difference here between, with the last two functions is that our method is now delete because we want to be deleting the task. So we have to receive a delete request. And the only difference here is now if we have a task that we found with that specified task ID, we'll delete it from our dictionary, return the deleted object, and then return with a response code 200 indicating success. So let's add a request. That's called delete task. Let's make it a delete function. And the URL is the same as the previous one. So let's see if this deletes the task with ID 0. So ID 0, we got the task that we specified. Is it actually deleted? Let's find out. Boom. So it was deleted because originally we had task 0 and task 1, but now we only have task 1. Cool. So everything works. A few things I want to mention before we wrap up this demo is, one, let's write some documentation. So in Python, you can do single line comments and multi-line comments. Single line comments are done through hashtag and whatever's followed by it is in comments. Multi-line comments are done through triple quotation marks, and whatever's contained between them is going to be commented, so it's not going to actually influence your code. So get tasks, retrieve all tasks. Create task is create new task. Get task by task ID is retrieve task by task ID. Update task, right? Same thing, update task by task ID. And deleting task is same thing, delete task, with task ID. Nice. All right, the last thing I want to show you guys before we wrap up this demo is how to export a collection on Postman. So we use all these requests to test our code, and the way we export it and show to other people that you've tested your code properly is by exporting this. Now, how do we export it? Well, if you hover over the collection itself, there's a button that says export. So let's click on that. Let's just go with the recommended version for exporting our Postman collection. When we click export, we can specify a location to save this. Let's save it in our folder with demo1. And we'll save it just within the demo1. Source is, again, for actual code files. So that would be app.py and requirements.txt, and that's it. Let's save it in here. And our collection was exported successfully. So that's the end of demo. We coded up 5 endpoints, and we have 5 requests to test them, test all the endpoints on Postman. Let me know if you have any other questions. Please, fill out your weekly feedback form, and I'll see you guys at lecture next.